The early morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick, gray clouds that hung low over the small rural town of Meadowfield. In a modest, weather-worn home at the edge of town lived the Adu family. It was a family that had once been filled with warmth and laughter, but now seemed consumed by tension and division. The mother, Martha Adu, sat in the living room, her face set in a permanent scowl. She was a woman in her early 50s, her features hardened by years of struggle and disappointment. Life had not been kind to her, and in turn, she had become a woman who found little joy in anything, least of all her eldest son, Daniel. Daniel was 28, a man of humble demeanor with broad shoulders that carried the invisible weight of unfulfilled dreams. He was tall and wiry, with deep brown eyes that always seemed to hold a hint of sadness. From a young age, Daniel had been the dreamer of the family. He had aspired to become a teacher, someone who could inspire and guide others. But life, it seemed, had other plans for him. Martha's voice, sharp and filled with disdain, cut through the silence of the house. "Daniel, are you still sitting there? Have you no shame? Every day, you sit around doing nothing while your younger brother is out there making something of himself." Her words were like daggers, aimed to wound, and they found their mark. Daniel, seated on a worn wooden chair near the kitchen, looked up slowly. He had heard these words before, too many times to count. Each time, they stung just as much as the first. "I've been applying for jobs, Mama," Daniel said softly, his voice steady but tinged with fatigue. "I went to the city last week and dropped off my resume at 3 different schools." Martha scoffed, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "And what did that get you? Nothing as usual. You're wasting your time and this family's resources. Look at your brother, Michael. He didn't sit around waiting for handouts. He went out and found work." Michael, the second son, was the golden child in Martha's eyes. At 25, he had secured a stable job as a clerk at a local business and contributed generously to the household. Where Daniel was quiet and reserved, Michael was confident and outgoing. He had a way of winning people over, and Martha never missed an opportunity to praise him. As Martha continued her tirade, Daniel's younger sister, Grace, entered the room. At 18, Grace was the baby of the family, with a bubbly personality and a sharp wit. She often tried to mediate between her mother and Daniel, though her efforts were rarely successful. "Mama, don't you think you're being too hard on Daniel?" Grace asked cautiously, glancing at her brother with a look of sympathy. "He's trying his best." Martha turned to Grace, her eyes narrowing. "Trying isn't good enough, Grace. This family needs results, not excuses. If he can't contribute, then he's nothing but a burden." Daniel stood up slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of his mother's words. He glanced at Grace, offering her a faint smile of gratitude for her support. "It's fine, Grace," he said quietly. "I'll find a way to make things right." Martha Adu had not always been so bitter. Once, she had been a loving and hopeful woman, proud of her children and eager to see them succeed. But years of financial struggle had eroded her patience and optimism. After the death of her husband, Jacob Adu, Martha had been left to raise 3 children on her own. Jacob had been a kind and hard-working man, but his sudden passing from a heart attack had plunged the family into turmoil. Without Jacob's income, Martha had taken up various jobs to make ends meet, cleaning houses, selling produce at the market, and even working as a seamstress. The stress of providing for her family had hardened her, and she began to measure her children's worth by their ability to contribute financially. Daniel, as the eldest, had borne the brunt of her expectations. When he failed to secure a stable job after finishing his education, Martha's disappointment turned to resentment. She saw him as a reflection of her own failures, and that bitterness poisoned their relationship. Daniel had always been a bright and curious child. Growing up, he excelled in school, often ranking at the top of his class. His teachers had high hopes for him, and he had dreamed of becoming a teacher himself, inspired by their encouragement. But after graduating from university, Daniel faced a harsh reality. Jobs in Meadowfield were scarce, and teaching positions were even harder to come by. He applied for roles in nearby towns and cities, but his lack of experience and connections made it nearly impossible to secure a position. To support himself, Daniel took on odd jobs, working as a laborer on construction sites, helping out at local farms, and even tutoring children for a small fee. Despite his efforts, the money he earned was barely enough to cover his own expenses, let alone contribute to the family. As Daniel left the house that morning, he felt a familiar mix of frustration and determination. He walked down the dusty road that led to town, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could turn his life around. Unbeknownst to him, this day would mark the beginning of a journey that would change everything for him and for his family. The clouds above began to part, and a ray of sunlight broke through, illuminating the path ahead. It was a small but significant sign, a glimmer of hope in a life that had been overshadowed by doubt and despair. The town of Meadowfield, though modest, was bustling with life that morning. Vendors lined the streets, their stalls brimming with fresh produce, woven baskets, and handmade trinkets. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and the distant aroma of roasted corn. Daniel walked through the market square, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. He nodded politely to the few familiar faces that acknowledged him but avoided lingering. It wasn't that Daniel disliked the people of Meadowfield. On the contrary, he loved the community spirit that held the town together. But over the years, he had grown weary of the pitiful looks and whispered comments that followed him wherever he went. "There goes Martha Adou's useless son," they would say. Such a shame for a young man with his education. Daniel pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. He had heard from a neighbor that a nearby construction site was looking for laborers. Though the pay was minimal and the work grueling, it was better than nothing. As he approached the site, Daniel noticed a crowd of men gathered near the entrance. They were rugged, muscular individuals, many of whom were seasoned laborers. Daniel, with his lean frame and scholarly demeanor, felt out of place among them, but he steeled himself and joined the queue. The site manager, a burly man named Mr. Thompson, stood at the front of the line, assessing each candidate with a critical eye. When it was Daniel's turn, Mr. Thompson looked him up and down, his expression skeptical. "You don't look like you've done much hard labor, boy," Thompson said gruffly. "I may not look it, sir," Daniel replied, meeting his gaze, "but I'm strong, and I'm willing to work hard." Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You got any experience?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir, but I'm a quick learner." Thompson sighed and scratched his beard. "All right, I'll give you a chance. But if you can't keep up, you're out." "Understood." "Yes, sir. Thank you." Mr. Thompson had been overseeing construction projects in Meadowfield for over a decade. He was known for his no-nonsense attitude and high standards, but also for giving underdogs a chance. Thompson himself had come from a humble background, starting as a laborer before working his way up to site manager. He saw a glimmer of determination in Daniel's eyes that reminded him of his younger self. While he doubted Daniel's ability to endure the physical demands of the job, he respected the young man's willingness to try. Daniel's first day on the job was nothing short of brutal. The sun blazed down mercilessly as he hauled heavy bags of cement, mixed concrete, and carried bricks to and from the construction site. His hands, unaccustomed to such labor, blistered within hours. His muscles ached, and sweat poured down his face, soaking his clothes. The other workers, noticing his struggle, offered little sympathy. Some mocked him openly, laughing at his clumsy attempts to keep up. "You sure you're cut out for this, scholar?" one of them jeered. But Daniel gritted his teeth and kept going. Each insult fueled his determination. He reminded himself that this was temporary, a stepping stone towards something better. By the end of the day, he was exhausted but proud of himself for not giving up. As Daniel was leaving the site that evening, he noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench near the road. The man was dressed in simple but clean clothes, with a kind face framed by a neatly trimmed white beard. He appeared to be in his late 60s, but his eyes sparkled with youthful energy. "Good evening, young man," the old man greeted as Daniel passed by. "Good evening, sir," Daniel replied politely, stopping to catch his breath. "You look like you've had a long day," the man observed, his tone gentle. Daniel nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's been tough, but I'm managing." The man smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Hard work builds character, you know. But it's not the only way to get ahead in life." Daniel tilted his head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes you need to use your mind as well as your hands," the man said. "Tell me, what's your story?" Backstory: the elderly man, the old man, whose name was Mr. Emmanuel, was a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Meadowfield for most of his life. He had dedicated his career to nurturing young minds and had earned a reputation as a wise and compassionate mentor. Though he no longer taught formally, he often spent his days offering advice and encouragement to those in need. Daniel shared his story with Mr. Emmanuel, recounting his struggles to find work and his strained relationship with his mother. The old man listened intently, nodding thoughtfully as Daniel spoke. "You have a good heart, Daniel," Mr. Emmanuel said when he finished, "and I can see that you're not afraid of hard work. But have you ever considered pursuing your dream of teaching again?" Daniel sighed. "I've tried, sir, but every school I apply to says the same thing. No experience, no job." Mr. Emmanuel's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "Experience is important, yes, but sometimes what matters more is who you know. I happen to have a few connections in the education sector. Perhaps I could help." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "You do that for me?" "Why not?" Mr. Emmanuel said with a shrug. "You remind me of myself when I was your age, full of potential but lacking opportunity. Sometimes all a person needs is a little push." For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a surge of hope. He thanked Mr. Emmanuel profusely, promising to make the most of any opportunity that came his way. As he walked home that evening, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like there might be a way forward. The following morning, Meadowfield awoke to the sounds of bustling activity. Roosters crowed in unison, signaling the start of a new day, and the faint hum of early risers echoed through the streets. In the Adu household, however, the atmosphere was as cold and tense as ever. Martha Adu sat at the dining table, sipping her morning tea with an air of practiced indifference. She had barely acknowledged Daniel since he returned the night before, exhausted and aching from his first day at the construction site. Her silence was as cutting as her words, and it was something Daniel had grown used to. Grace, however, couldn't help but notice her brother's fatigue. As she entered the kitchen to prepare breakfast, she paused to study him. Daniel sat by the window, staring out at the horizon, his face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Good morning, Daniel," Grace said softly, placing a plate of yam and stew in front of him. Daniel turned to her with a faint smile. "Good morning, Grace." "Thank you." Grace hesitated, then sat across from him. "You're working so hard, Daniel. I wish Mama could see how much you're trying." Daniel shook his head. "It doesn't matter what she thinks. I just have to keep going." Martha's voice, sharp and impatient, interrupted their conversation. "Grace, stop wasting time and finish your chores. Daniel doesn't need your sympathy. What he needs is to grow up and take responsibility for his life." Grace sighed but didn't respond. She had learned long ago that arguing with their mother was futile. Grace, the youngest of the Adu siblings, had always been the peacemaker. From a young age, she had witnessed the strain between her mother and Daniel and had done her best to bridge the gap. Despite her youth, Grace possessed a maturity beyond her years, often serving as a source of comfort and encouragement for her eldest brother. She admired Daniel deeply, not only for his resilience, but for his kindness and humility. While Michael basked in their mother's praise and often turned a blind eye to Daniel's struggles, Grace stood by her brother, offering support in whatever small ways she could. Later that afternoon, as Daniel prepared to leave for his second day at the construction site, there was a knock at the door. Martha, who had been busy mending a torn shirt, frowned in annoyance. "Grace, go see who it is," she ordered. Grace hurried to the door and opened it to find Mr. Emanuel standing on the porch, a warm smile on his face. "Good afternoon, young lady," he greeted. "Is Daniel home?" Grace blinked in surprise, but quickly nodded. "Yes, sir. Please come in." Mr. Emanuel stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. Despite his age, there was an air of wisdom and authority about him that made people sit up and take notice. "Good afternoon, Madame Edu," he said politely, addressing Martha. Martha looked up, her expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Good afternoon. And you are?" "My name is Emmanuel," he said, extending a hand. "I'm a retired teacher and an old friend of the Edu family's late patriarch. I had the pleasure of meeting your son, Daniel, yesterday, and I've come to speak with him." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't sure what to make of this unexpected visitor, but she nodded curtly. "Daniel is in the back. Grace, call him." Moments later, Daniel entered the room, his surprise evident when he saw Mr. Emanuel. "Mr. Emanuel," he said warmly, shaking the older man's hand. "I wasn't expecting you. I hope I'm not interrupting," Mr. Emanuel said with a smile. "I want to follow up on our conversation from yesterday. Do you have a moment to talk?" Daniel nodded. "Of course. Please, have a seat." As they sat together, Mr. Emanuel wasted no time getting to the point. "Daniel, I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe I can help. I have a friend in the city who runs a private school. He's always on the lookout for passionate individuals, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. "A private school? But I don't have the experience they're looking for." Mr. Emanuel waved a hand dismissively. "Experience is important, yes, but so is potential. And I see a great deal of potential in you. If you're willing to take a chance, I can arrange for an interview." Daniel hesitated, the weight of his mother's criticism heavy on his mind. "I don't know, sir. What if I fail?" "You won't," Mr. Emanuel said firmly. "You're more capable than you realize, Daniel. Sometimes, all we need is someone to believe in us. Let me be that person for you." As the conversation unfolded, Martha listened silently from her corner of the room. Her expression was unreadable, but her thoughts were racing. She had never seen Daniel interact with someone so confidently, nor had she ever heard anyone speak so highly of him. When Mr. Emanuel finally left, Daniel turned to his mother, his excitement barely contained. "Mama, this could be the opportunity I've been waiting for. If I get this job, I can start contributing to the family." But instead of encouragement, Martha's response was cold and dismissive. "We'll see if anything comes of it," she said, turning back to her mending. "Don't get your hopes up." Daniel felt a pang of disappointment, but refused to let it dampen his spirits. For the first time in years, he had a glimmer of hope, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The following week, Daniel prepared for his interview with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Mr. Emanuel provided guidance, coaching him on how to present himself and answering potential questions. When the day of the interview arrived, Daniel boarded a bus to the city, clutching a folder containing his resume and certificates. As the bus rumbled down the winding roads, he stared out the window, his mind filled with both doubts and dreams. Unbeknownst to him, this journey marked the beginning of a transformation that would not only change his life, but also force his family to confront their own prejudices and regrets. The city was a stark contrast to the quiet life of Meadowfield. The bustling streets, towering buildings, and constant hum of activity were overwhelming, yet exhilarating for Daniel. It was his first time stepping outside the confines of a small town, and while he marveled at the sheer scale of the city, he couldn't ignore the gnawing anxiety in his chest. Clutching his folder tightly, Daniel navigated the crowded streets with the help of directions Mr. Emanuel had written down for him. His destination was Oakwood Academy, a prestigious private school known for its emphasis on nurturing young talent. The school's reputation preceded it, and Daniel couldn't help but wonder if he was truly ready for this opportunity. When he finally arrived, the sight of the grand gates and sprawling campus left him momentarily speechless. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked through the gates. Determined to give it his all, Daniel was greeted by a friendly receptionist who directed him to the principal's office. The waiting area outside the office was adorned with plaques, trophies, and photographs of smiling students, testaments to the school's achievements. "Mr. Adu," a voice called, breaking his reverie. Daniel stood and turned to see a man in his late 40s approaching him. The man was tall and imposing, with a sharp suit and a warm smile that belied his authoritative demeanor. "I'm Mr. Bennett, the principal," the man said, extending a hand. "Pleased to meet you, sir," Daniel replied, shaking his hand firmly. The interview that followed was both challenging and enlightening. Mr. Bennett asked probing questions about Daniel's background, his aspirations, and how he would handle various classroom scenarios. Despite his nerves, Daniel answered with honesty and passion, drawing on his love for learning and his desire to make a difference in the lives of young people. As the interview concluded, Mr. Bennett leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel thoughtfully. "Your potential, Daniel," he said finally. "You're raw, but I see a fire in you that's rare. I'm willing to give you a chance. We'll start you as an assistant teacher, and if you prove yourself, there's room for growth." Daniel's heart soared with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Mr. Bennett had been the principal of Oakwood Academy for over a decade. A former teacher himself, he had a keen eye for spotting talent and believed in giving underdogs a chance. He saw something in Daniel that reminded him of his own struggles as a young educator and decided to take a leap of faith. Returning to Meadowfield with the news of his new job, Daniel was met with mixed reactions. Grace was overjoyed, her pride in her brother evident. Michael, on the other hand, dismissed it as a stroke of luck, while Martha remained unimpressed. "Let's see how long it lasts," she muttered when Daniel shared his excitement. Undeterred, Daniel threw himself into his new role at Oakwood Academy. The first few weeks were challenging as he adjusted to the demands of teaching, but his natural ability to connect with students soon shone through. His classes were engaging and lively, and he quickly earned the respect of both his colleagues and his students. Months turned into a year, and Daniel's dedication began to pay off. He was promoted to a full-time teaching position, and his salary allowed him to support his family in ways he had never imagined. He sent money home regularly, ensuring that Grace could pursue her education and that their household no longer struggled to make ends meet. But while his generosity was appreciated by Grace, Martha's pride prevented her from acknowledging his efforts. She continued to belittle him, though her words carried less weight as Daniel's success became undeniable. One evening, as Daniel was grading papers in his small apartment, he received a call from Mr. Emanuel. "Daniel, there's someone I think you should meet," Mr. Emanuel said cryptically. "Can you come to my house tomorrow evening?" Curious, Daniel agreed. The next evening, he arrived at Mr. Emanuel's home to find a woman waiting for him. She was elegantly dressed, with an air of confidence and warmth. "This is Mrs. Roberts," Mr. Emanuel introduced. "She is the director of a nonprofit organization that supports underprivileged children through education." Mrs. Roberts smiled. "I've heard a lot about you, Daniel. Your story is inspiring, and I'd like to offer you an opportunity to work with us. We're looking for someone with your passion and experience to lead a new initiative in rural education." Daniel was taken aback. The offer was a dream come true, a chance to make a broader impact. Mrs. Roberts was a philanthropist who had dedicated her life to improving access to education for marginalized communities. She had a keen eye for talent and believed that individuals like Daniel were key to driving meaningful change. As Daniel's career flourished, Word of his success spread throughout Meadowfield. Martha could no longer deny the truth. Her eldest son, the one she had written off as a failure, had risen above his circumstances to achieve greatness. One evening, as Daniel visited home, Martha finally broke down. "I was wrong about you, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I let my bitterness blind me to your potential. Can you ever forgive me?" Daniel looked at her, his heart heavy with a mixture of sorrow and compassion. "I've already forgiven you, Mama," he said softly. But forgiveness doesn't erase the pain. Martha's regret was profound, and though Daniel accepted her apology, their relationship would never be the same. Daniel accepted Mrs. Roberts' offer and spent the next decade transforming rural education across the country. His work earned him national recognition, and his story became an inspiration to countless others. Back in Meadowfield, Grace thrived, following in her brother's footsteps to pursue a career in education. Martha lived long enough to see the profound impact Daniel made, though she carried the weight of her regrets to her grave. In the end, Daniel's journey was a testament to the power of resilience, forgiveness, and the belief that no matter how difficult the circumstances, change is always possible.